In the last film, we looked at the reconstruction of an early amphibian from its fossilized remains. At Newcastle University Department of Zoology, Dr. Alec Panshin talks about the difficulty of deciding how the first reptiles may have emerged from amphibian ancestors.
If one looks at a reptile, such as a lizard, and then an amphibian, such as a newt or a salamander, the differences between the two aren't so obvious, and it becomes very much worse when you try and go back into the fossil record looking in the Carboniferous period for very early amphibians or reptiles to say whether any particular fossil you've got is an amphibian or a reptile. For a very long time, people thought that an animal called Seamoria, whose skull we've got here, was not a reptile, but at least a relict, a leftover from the group of amphibians which gave rise to reptiles. Now, there are various technical reasons for saying that this probably isn't so, but if one looks at its skeleton, it's clear that it was a perfectly good land-going animal, but then there are other perfectly good land-going animals at the time, and microsaurs are sort of rivals to the group that Seamoria belongs to as possible reptile ancestors, or at least associated with the origin of reptiles in some way. But again, when one gets to the skull, it's very difficult to say, have we got a reptile, have we got something related to a reptile, and so on. If we look at a living reptile, or at least look at the whole biology of living reptiles, you have then to decide what are the significant features of reptiles. And the overriding one, which we're going to be very lucky indeed to find in fossils, is the particular sort of egg that reptiles and also birds have, which is evolved to be completely independent of water, to hatch and so on land. Now, the chances of finding an egg like that, there are fossil eggs known, but you can't make much of what's inside them. The chance of finding one of those associated with an animal, so that you can say that animal or its relations laid that egg, is almost infinitely small. And so we have to get at things in another way, sort of negative evidence. If one looks at fossil amphibia, early fossil amphibia from the Carboniferous and Permian periods, you often find that they have grooves on the skull, and these grooves contain what are known as lateral line canals. They are sense organs that an animal uses when it's living most of its time underwater. And so as a first approximation, we could start off with, say this: if we find a fossil which has got these lateral line canals, which it's inherited from its fish ancestors, then it's almost certainly not a reptile. An even better test, but a more difficult one to apply, is if an animal had a tadpole, then it didn't have the amniote or cleidoic egg. It therefore is an amphibian. And we have, in fact, in some fossil amphibian, a creature where we've got growth stages, where it has little gills when it first hatches, and then you can see successive larger and larger specimens in which the gills finally disappear. So that, emphatically, is not a reptile, and you can then apply a sort of principle of guilt by association and say that anything closely related to it, and certainly anything which is descendant from it and has the same sort of characters, belongs to the same group, is not a reptile either. So that gets us a bit further forward. And then, then saying what is a fossil reptile becomes a very negative sort of thing. The little skull of Romeria is that generally you agree to be that of a fairly early and very primitive reptile, but it is entirely on this sort of negative judgment. It hasn't got any of these amphibian characters. It didn't have in any stage of its life history, as far as we know, lateral line canals. It didn't have a tadpole, and it's got what paleontologists call a reptiliomorph skeleton, one which is obviously that of a land-living animal. And then after that, one's stuck with a sort of theory of, well, this sort of animal may have given rise to later reptiles. There's nothing to debar it from having done so. And that's about as near as one can get.
Whatever the details of their origins, reptiles were important animals at the start of the Mesozoic era 225 million years ago. Here, in the petrified forest region of northern Arizona, there are many fossil reptile remains. Dr. Richard Cifelli.
we've just discovered something here. It's a little bit premature to tell what it is exactly. But I'm working it back with the dental tools, standard tool of paleontologists, and chisels and paintbrush, and you work it back very carefully and squirt glue on the bone. This is very watered down glue. It's important to get enough glue into the bone so that it soaks it up and doesn't fall apart. This appears to be a large enough specimen so that we'll probably have to jacket it, that is, put some plaster support so it doesn't fall to pieces on the ride back to town.
Recent weathering has exposed a little of the fossil, and Dr. Cifelli must uncover it completely before trying to remove it. It's the jawbone of a phytosaur, one of a group of carnivorous reptiles of the Triassic period.
I've got the fossil covered with surgeon's bandages now, and I'm going to put sacking over top of that for added strength. The sacking is thoroughly covered with plaster of Paris, a technique which has been used for well over 100 years among paleontologists. Well, this side's just about done now. I'm smoothing down the last of the plaster. We'll give it about 20 minutes to set, and then flip the fossil over very carefully so that pieces don't fall out the other side, and then jacket that too. It'll make a complete cast around the whole fossil.
After a lot of work in the great heat of the desert, the fossil, plastered up and splintered, can at last be taken away for work in the laboratory at the Museum of Northern Arizona in Flagstaff. The USA and Canada are very rich in fossil remains of this kind.
Well, we brought the specimen back to the lab where we can prepare it under controlled conditions. These things have a remarkable tendency to fall apart. And what I'll be doing here is using the vibrator saw and cutting the jacket around the margin here, and then gradually trying to pry it off. Okay, I've got the jacket removed now, and we've got some minor breakage here that these pieces get glued back down, and we'll remove all the rest of the matrix from around the bone and take the paper off, etc.
The fossil is finally cleaned up. There are the tooth sockets. They carried the sharp, peg-like teeth typical of many reptiles. And here's what the animal must have looked like, reconstructed from many fossil remains which have been excavated and cleaned up. Here at the Museum of Northern Arizona, another reconstruction. Pentaceratops, a horned dinosaur from the Cretaceous period, between 136 and about 65 million years ago. This is its skull. Its jaws became skewed sideways after death. It's upside down, by the way. There are big, blunt teeth, showing that it was a herbivore, a plant eater. Fossilized plants, such as it might have fed on, were found with the skull, a leaf. Another plant. And another. And a thick stem. Not only can we reconstruct extinct animals from fossil fragments, We can also in some cases discover what they ate, how they lived, from fossil evidence. Reptiles, including the dinosaurs, were dominant animals for many millions of years, until about 60 million years ago, when the age of the mammals arrived. At the British Museum of Natural History in London, some fossils illustrating the possible derivation of mammals from early reptiles. This is Cynognathus, an early reptile which lived about 200 million years ago. Here's its fossil skull. Look at the teeth. They show heterodonty, teeth of more than one type. This mammal-like reptile had stabbing canine teeth, and behind, chewing teeth, showing the beginning of cusps. A later mammal-like reptile, Proboscidon. Heterodonty again. And if we look underneath, there's a secondary palate, typical of mammals. These fossil reptiles illustrate how true mammals, like this wolf, may have evolved. Mammals have incisors, canines, premolars and molars, and a true secondary palate. Fossil evidence shows that mammals became dominant animals in comparatively recent times, in the Tertiary period, starting about 60 million years ago. In New York again, at the American Museum of Natural History, there are some very important fossil series illustrating evolution amongst the mammals. The Titanotheres. Earl Manning of the museum's staff.
The Titanotheres are a group of mammals that lived from a period of 50 million years ago till about 30 million years ago. And during this time, they evolved from rather small browsing animals to quite large, almost rhinoceros-like animals at the time of their extinction about 30 million years ago. And what you see when you look at the evolution of this group is the evolution of very peculiar head ornament. You can see the evolution of these horns in a very sort of gradual way because the record is so good for Titanotheres. You start out with tiny little bumps over the eyes of the animals. And the bumps get larger and larger in younger and younger forms. Till finally, in the ones about 30 million years ago, the horns become quite enormous. There's quite a bit of variety in these different sorts of horns. You have very large horns in the more specialized forms, which it's now thought were probably used in the same way that giraffes use their horns for wrestling with each other. The males would put their heads together and wrestle back and forth. Or sometimes it's thought, in any case, that the individuals would butt the flanks of the other animal. But there wasn't a sort of head-on ramming. When you see these large, impressive horns, you sometimes think of them coming at each other, but presumably that's not the case. There's quite a bit of difference between different sorts of Titanotheres, particularly in the more specialized versions that were the later forms. The American ones have two horns sort of sweeping forward in a gentle curve, and the Mongolian and Chinese ones have a very different sort of arrangement, where there's sort of one large horn sweeping up in the front, presumably with some sort of long proboscis, or a nose at least, way high on the end of the horn. Both of these groups died out around 30 million years ago. Why they became extinct is unclear, but they did about that time, and there are no living relatives of them.
A mammal which is not extinct, the fossil record of the evolution of the horse.
The fossil horses have an extremely good record. They were one of the first groups of fossils that was used as evidence by the people who first came up with the idea of evolution, and Huxley in particular, as an example of an actual sequence of animals evolving. the record of the horses is so good because there is complete deposition in America at that time. So there's an unusually complete sequence. You can see very small changes from one type of horse to another. They start out as very small, browsing animals, presumably living in jungles.
Hyracotherium, or Eohippus, the dawn horse, a small animal about the size of a large terrier dog, which lived about 50 million years ago. Look at the foreleg. There are 4 toes. The skull. The teeth have quite low crowns, suggesting that they were not subject to much wear during the animal's lifetime. It must have fed on soft vegetation. Here's a fossil tooth. Mesohippus, a little bit bigger, from the Oligocene, maybe 35 million years ago. Only 3 toes on the foreleg, and the central one is becoming slightly enlarged. The teeth have slightly higher crowns. A Miocene horse from about 26 million years ago. It's quite definitely bigger. The side toes no longer reach the ground, and the central toe is much stronger looking for speed in running. These animals lived in grassland and had teeth with higher crowns to accommodate greater wear because of the coarser vegetation which they ate. A Pliocene horse from about 5 million years ago, again a bigger animal. The central toe has become much nearer to the hoof of the modern horse, and this would have been a speedy beast. The teeth are very much longer to last a lifetime of feeding on coarse grasses. Look at the high crown. A later Pliocene specimen, bigger still, and very near to Equus, the modern horse. The hoof, which was once a central toe, and the side toes have degenerated into long, thin splint bones down the back of the leg, vestigial structures. And there are much longer teeth. The teeth are, in fact, very similar to those of the modern horse. The fossil sequence shows clearly how the hoof, amongst other features, has evolved. The fossil record for the horse presents striking evidence for a process of evolution from form to form. In Flagstaff, at the Research Center of the Museum of Northern Arizona, Professor Edwin Colbert again, on the importance of the fossil evidence for evolution.
Darwin, I think, wrote about the incompleteness of the fossil record, but it's interesting that since Darwin's time, the gaps have been filled in many cases, so that the record, even though there are some gaps, is rather complete in many instances. So I think that holds up and corroborates the validity of the fossil evidence. And of course, even where the fossil evidence is incomplete, we have other evidence among living animals for evolution that fleshes it out, that brings in the missing parts. So I think it all ties together.
In the films which follow, we shall look at some of this other evidence and see what it tells us about the relationships between living things and the processes of change which are still continuing today.
Thank you.